Today's lecture will cover just a few parts of medieval Europe, mostly just the Franks and monastic culture in a more general sense. And then you'll have some other material that will cover the Crusades, which is the other big part of medieval Europe that I want you all to learn about. As you can see on the timeline here, I have marked the opening of the first monastery in 360 CE in modern-day France. We have the length of the Merovingian dynasty from 460 CE to 752 CE. That's the first dynasty of the Franks. And then 751 to 888 CE, that's kind of an estimate because dates vary here, is the Carolingian dynasty, which was founded by the father of Charlemagne. So I also have here the period of many monastic reforms known as the Cluniac reforms. These are just monastic reforms. We won't get into detail about them, but I just wanted you to know where on the timeline those reforms were happening. What we mean by medieval Europe is the continent of Europe during roughly 450 CE to around 1450 CE. This is shortly after the fall of the classical Roman Empire until the founding of the printing press, the Renaissance in Italy. There's many different things that mark the end of medieval Europe, and the timing is contested, so keep that in mind. There are three main three main themes that influence medieval Europe and that really shape it. That is the old Roman Empire, and the infrastructures that the Roman Empire put in place, and old Roman Empire culture, as well as Germanic barbarian culture. Now, Germanic tribes, that doesn't mean that they're from the area of modern Germany. These are Germanic is a linguistic term denoting a certain common linguistic ancestor between these different quote-unquote barbarian tribes. These are some of the tribes who made incursions into the Roman Empire, and that some people have argued caused the fall of the Roman Empire. And then the last theme that greatly influences medieval Europe is Christianity. All of Europe's official language during this time was Latin. Latin was considered to be a language that most educated people, whether they were from Britain or Spain or Italy or Germany, wherever, that most educated people were fluent in Latin. So that was the official language. But Germanic tribes grafted their own languages onto conventional Latin. So today's French language, just for example, is derived from the Frankish tribes' quote-unquote barbarian language and classical Latin, a mixture of the two. Basically, the Franks' inability to pronounce Latin in the way that classical Romans did resulted over time in the development of the French language, and this happened everywhere. So this is kind of what stimulated a linguistic variety in Europe, and they kind of turned into vulgates, which are just sort of non-official, just folk languages. Now, I want to mention that the term barbarians it's sort of misleading, and it's one that I try to avoid. And the reason for this is that over time it's kind of come to be associated with stupidity or a lack of sophistication and a lack of culture. And this is not true of medieval European quote-unquote barbarian tribes. The Huns, the Franks, the Angles, the Lombards, the Vandals, and so on, just to name a few, were nomadic peoples without massive urban and agricultural settlements like the ones we saw in the Neolithic period in the Near East. Think, the city of Uruk, the Yellow River Valley civilization. Those were really advanced urban settlements. The barbarian tribes had no such settlements. They were nomadic. So this is all true. And they also had gruesome cultures of violence, and they valued masculinity and warfare and looting and pillaging. These things are also true, but their cultures were very rich and ancient, and they weren't at all static. They did not stay the same. The lives of Frankish peoples, for example, just taking the Frankish tribes, for example, changed dramatically during the medieval period from a very nomadic lifestyle to a more settled and traditionally sophisticated culture by the end of the medieval period. So let's talk a little bit about the Franks. The Franks settled in the former Roman province of Gaul. Here's an example of the former Roman Empire kind of shaping how we think of Europe today. They were recorded as being present at the Battle of Chalons in 451 CE, and this was the time when Attila the Hun was defeated. I think it was by Childeric. There were several Frankish tribes, all with their own king. So there wasn't just one. There was various different kinds of Frankish tribes, and sometimes they were at war with each other. They were all different from each other. So let's just kind of keep that in mind. The king of the Salian Franks, this is a particular branch of Frankish tribe, was named Merovech. His kingship and martial skills were so successful that he and his family were able to form the first Frankish dynasty in Europe, known as the Merovingian dynasty. By 509 CE, Merovech's grandson Clovis had converted to Roman Catholic Christianity. He had also defeated all other Frankish tribes, so the Salian Franks became the dominant Frankish tribe. He had also married a Burgundian princess. The Burgundian tribes were in an area, they were a Germanic tribe in the area, but they were not a Frankish tribe. So he's kind of using diplomacy here through marriage. The Merovingians were important because they transformed Frankish culture from a nomadic tribal one to a more sedentary and also Christian culture. And this isn't meant to be a value judgment that this is a good thing or a bad thing, whether sedentary or Christianity, whether these cultural influences were good or bad. They're, for the most part, both. So this was kind of for better or for worse. So Frankish Christianity was tested when the Moors, as you'll remember, who were North African Muslims who had settled in Spain, when the Moors invaded at Tours, which is a city in modern-day France. At this point, a new Frankish dynasty rose to prominence because of this battle. So Charles Martel, one of the administrators in charge of running the Frankish Empire, led the Frankish army against the Moors and claimed a stunning victory. And there's a picture of Charles Martel here at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE. Martel is credited with the Christianness of Europe. So most historians, or some historians at least, believe that Europe would have been predominantly Muslim if the Moors had continued their incursion into the European continent like they had done in Spain. So it's kind of interesting to think of Charles Martel as, the godfather of European Christianity. Whether or not that's true is still up for debate. So Martel never claimed kinship. So he was sort of the leader of this new and upcoming dynasty, but he never called himself a king. He just stuck with his administrative title that he had had in the former Frankish Empire. But his son, Pepin the Short, He exiled the last Merovingian king and was regarded by the Pope to be the true king of the Franks. So the Carolingian dynasty technically starts with Pepin the Short. So at the same, Pepin and Charles Martel, they were sort of alive at the same time that the Merovingian kings were still in existence, but they weren't very powerful. There was this sort of dual, or this sort of fake thing going on where Martel actually was the one who had all the power, but there were Merovingian kings that were king by name. Well, Pepin put an end to that, exiled the last Merovingian king, and just said, hey, I'm the king now. So Pepin also, he has a few great claims to fame. First of all, he founded the dynasty, obviously. Second, he conquered swaths of land in Italy and he gifted it to the Pope. So he's encouraging this relationship between France and the Pope. This land became the Papal States and included the city of Rome, where Vatican City now lies. So the Papal States in medieval times, the Pope was actually a temporal as well as a spiritual leader. He was the head of the army of the Papal States in Italy, which fought with all of the other city-states in Italy at the time. So this gift that Pepin gave to the Pope initiated a close relationship between France and the Pope that lasted for over a millennium. And, even 1,000 years later in the 18th century, the Pope, France had a special place in the heart of the Pope. Pepin's last claim to fame was that he fathered the boy who would soon become Charlemagne. And he was born in 742 CE. So this is a picture of little baby Charlemagne, but at the time he would have been known as Charles. Charlemagne was, like his Frankish ancestors, violent and warlike. He waged 46 years worth of warfare during his reign. And one time he beheaded thousands of Saxons in one day because they refused to convert to Christianity. So this is sort of a very cruel, violent sort of regime that he has going here. But he also headed a cultural revival unlike Europe had seen for centuries. And he was able to do so because he conquered most of Western Europe. So they were enjoying a lot of stability. These various tribes that had inhabited this area of Western Europe weren't just constantly fighting. There was some peace. And you can see the extent of his Carolingian Empire here. Charlemagne developed a small but organized administration that kept Europe stable and prosperous during his reign. He also benefited from the trade of Slavic slaves, and that's where the term Slavic actually comes from, is from the word slave, or slave actually comes from the word Slavic, is probably a better way to word that. These Slavic slaves were captured in battle, and they were traded to the Arab world by Charlemagne and his administration. And the Arabs, as we've seen, were arguably the most advanced, sophisticated culture in the world at the time. And the Franks were in constant contact with the sophisticated world through their slave trade. This was a change from later years of the Roman Empire, so the 5th century CE. Roman Gallic traders avoided trading with Jews and Arabs, and this led to economic stagnation. Some have argued that this was one of the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire, was this sort of prejudice toward trading with people who were not Roman. And the soil of Roman Gaul had also become depleted by the overplanting of wheat during the empire, during the Roman Empire. So the Merovingian and Carolingian Franks were really successful in that they learned to plant barley and rye instead of wheat. And barley and rye are grains that flourish in wheat-depleted soil. So they're not getting these low, crappy yields of wheat harvested. They're getting really great yields of barley and rye because barley and rye can grow in this soil that has been so depleted by hundreds of years of wheat. Charlemagne was trying to improve Latin literacy in Europe, and one of the ways that he did this was by establishing what is now known as the Charter of Modern Thought in 787 CE. So this is really just like a speech that he made to important people, claiming that literacy was important and that monasteries where all of the learned people lived, because monks were really the primary people who were literate, could and should teach people who are willing to learn to read. This is sort of an education reform in its simplest sense. Charlemagne also patronized the development of a book hand called Carolingian minuscule, and you can see an example of this here. So it's a form of writing that made books more accessible and more readable. So in his own way, Charlemagne was kind of working toward a more literate society. Carolingian art and architecture was also incredibly influential, and much of it still exists today. It harkened back to the height of the Roman Empire, yet it was also rooted in the officialization of Christianity as a state religion. From 768 CE to 855 CE, the Franks built 27 new cathedrals, 417 new monasteries, and 100 new royal residences. So this is just massive amounts of construction of these very beautiful buildings. In 800 CE, Charlemagne traveled to Rome to be crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III. Many regarded him as the first emperor of Western Rome, as opposed to Eastern Rome, which were the Byzantines, in almost 400 years. And this is really amazing if you think about it. Barbarians are generally considered to be the reason for the fall of the Roman Empire, the incursions that barbarians made on the empire, and the plunging of the former empire into the Dark Ages. This is traditionally thought to be the fault of barbarians. Once these very sophisticated Romans were no longer in charge of the government and barbarians were, we fall into the Dark Ages, no one's learning anything, there's no trade. This is all not accurate, but that's the traditional narrative of history. So it's so interesting that Charlemagne was considered to be the first emperor of Western Rome in 400 years, because he was a quote-unquote barbarian. He was descended directly from these Germanic tribes. And he was successful where the supposedly sophisticated and knowledgeable Romans had failed. So a barbarian, a Frank, was able to Christianize, unite, and revitalize Europe in a way that the Romans weren't really able to do. And he even took the title of Roman Emperor after his coronation. The Carolingian Empire fell apart shortly after Charlemagne's death. It's important to keep in mind, but he changed the character of Western Europe forever. It's sort of a point of interest among historians how short-lived Charlemagne's empire really was, and how it was so closely associated with him as a person, because once he died, his heirs were just not able to maintain the empire in the way that he had, and within a generation or two they had lost all of the power that they had. And as the traditional narrative goes, Europe was plunged back into the Dark Ages. You'll remember when I said earlier that under the Carolingians 417 monasteries were built. And I want to focus on this for a minute. Medieval Europe was shaped profoundly by monasticism. And when I say monasticism, I mean the life of Catholic monks who were living at monasteries. Over time, there came to be many religious orders of monks, but from 530 CE to 900 CE, so the first kind of half of medieval Europe, all monks were Benedictine monks. And it was the only official religious order at the time. Benedict of Nursia had established a monastery. He and his monastic rules were the only religious order. Benedictine monks copied manuscripts, they created elaborate illustrations, and they performed indoor and outdoor chores, and they lived a communal lifestyle. Monks took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and stability. And monasticism underwent several reforms between the 9th and 10th centuries when new orders like the Cistercians and Carthusians were created. So their lifestyles and their theologies and their worldview changed over time, but the role of Catholic monasteries remained relatively constant throughout the medieval period. And if you look here, we have kind of a diagram of a medieval monastery, and it shows all the different kinds of areas they had. A church, a hostelry, which is where you would have kind of offered accommodation to travelers. We have the scriptorium, which is where the monks read and copied and illustrated manuscripts. You have the church, which is where the church services were held, pretty obviously. The chapter house, which is where the abbot presided over the day-to-day running of the monastery. You have the cloister, which kind of means a closed gallery where the monks meditated. And then you have the refectory, which is kind of where you'd have your meals and the cooking. And it's important to keep in mind that the monks ate in total silence. And then you have monk cells. That's where, the monks would live in small, very simple cells. Monasteries were the centers of intellectual life. Monks were the ones who read all books that were there to be read. They copied them, they revised them even. They illuminated them, which is basically illustrating them with these very complex, beautiful illustrations. Monks also worked on Christian theology. They hypothesized about the meaning of life, about interpretation of the Bible, and they taught lay people their thoughts, especially in accordance with Charlemagne's charter that I mentioned earlier. They also cared for the poor, offering alms or charity, and the hungry and the homeless. They were the hospitals, the orphanages, the hotels, the universities, the libraries, and eventually even the nightclubs of medieval Europe. Yes, I said nightclubs. So monasteries and other religious communities were so central to European medieval life that most social occasions revolved around the church. Okay, so towards the later centuries of the medieval period, many monks brewed ale or beer, and this is a wood cutting of a monk brewing beer. They hosted parties, weddings, funerals, betrothals, baptism celebrations, or just feasts. There were many, many Catholic feasts. I think like 1 or 2 every week. They would host these sort of feast parties where people in the village would all come to eat and drink and be merry. And so churches were also the center of just everyday social life, as well as intellectual life. So this was the status of medieval Europe on the eve of the Crusades in the 11th century CE. And I'm going to leave off here because I have another source which does a much better job of covering the Crusades than I can do. But this sort of gives you a general overview of how the old Roman Empire Germanic barbarian culture, and Christianity were those three main building blocks for medieval Europe.